Hello and welcome to another YouTube episode of The Gay Aristo. And tonight I am very excited as we have a special guest, the author and activist Neil McKenna. Hello, Neil. Welcome.
Hello.
Thank you for joining us. I first encountered you when I was on another podcast talking about Oscar Wilde, and I was doing my research diligently on Oscar Wilde. And I came across your fantastic book, The Secret Life of Oscar Wilde, which I want to talk to you about in detail tonight. But firstly, you're a writer and an activist. Can you tell me a little bit about your own career and why you have focused in on LGBTQ plus history?
Well, this may come as a surprise to some people, but I happen to be gay. I think when I was younger, and I wanted to find out about my gay past, and I started looking for material on Oscar Wilde. I'd seen the film with Peter Finch, The Trials of Oscar Wilde, and of course I'd absolutely fallen in love with Peter Finch because he was terribly handsome. And I did actually meet him when I was 18 or 19. I was having lunch. I blushed and stuttered and blushed, and Peter Finch was absolutely charming. Anyway, so I started trying to find out about Oscar Wilde, and I kept reading this narrative of Oscar Wilde as a heterosexual man married to a beautiful woman with two beautiful sons, who was seduced, corrupted into the disease of homosexuality, after which blackmail, prostitution, crime, punishment, disease and death all followed in rapid succession. And because I didn't know any better, I believed it. But as life went on, I thought this cannot be the case. And when I was at university, Richard Ellman's book came out, which is a wonderful book. I mean, it's beautifully written and monumental, but it promotes this narrative of Oscar Wilde, the heterosexual, who becomes a victim. He flies too close to the sun like Icarus, and his wings melt and he falls to earth with a crash. And I fundamentally disagreed with that, because at roughly the same time I started reading the letters of Oscar Wilde, and I noticed in those letters that there were lots and lots of kind of homoerotic and gay references. So I thought it would be, I was middle-aged by the time I got round to writing this book, and I thought I might write a short thing about Oscar Wilde's sexuality, just as a kind of countervalence to this kind of received notion. So I, thought, oh, I'll do this book. I got an agent, Andrew Loney, who you met. He did a thing in a magazine saying he was looking for interesting non-fiction projects, and I wrote to him and said, I think I'm an interesting non-fiction project.
When you wrote the book, you really sort of interrupted the perceived narrative of the heterosexual happily married man who was seduced by Robbie in a toilet. What was the response from critics and the public to that claiming of the narrative as an LGBTQ plus story?
Hostile.
Right, yeah.
In a word, hostile. Yeah. There's a lot of discussion and debate we can have about cultural appropriation. And we can talk about the fact that Oscar Wilde has been claimed and appropriated by the heterosexual majority. It is in their interest to have Oscar Wilde as a heterosexual. It is not in their interest to have Oscar Wilde as a homosexual.
Why do you think that? That's a fascinating point. Why do you believe that it's within their interests to keep him straight?
Well, because he was a genius. He was a wonderful playwright. He was a writer of short stories. And suddenly, if you're writing, for example, fairy stories for children, and they're written by a raging sodomite, those stories become less attractive. Oscar Wilde is part, whether we like it or not, of the cultural landscape. So it's better that he's appropriated and owned and Disneyfied by the heterosexual majority rather than as an outlaw sodomite, which is what he was.
And LGBTQ plus history, to some extent, has been almost edited out of existence, hasn't it? The straight majority have taken the bits they don't like and sort of removed them from the narrative.
Well, it's not so much been edited, it's been absolutely obliterated and destroyed. So what we have to do is we have to pick up the fragments, the shards, the detritus that's been left around and somehow carefully put it together to restore it, to try and recreate some semblance of our history. It's as if a nuclear bomb has destroyed our history, and we are archivists, archaeologists, where we just have to go and make it somehow, put it back together and retell it for future generations.
Sometimes I get messages on the Gay Aristo Instagram or here on YouTube where people say, oh, why do you talk about gay history? Why is it important that they were gay or she was a lesbian or they were trans? What would you say when people say it doesn't matter that they were gay, it's just history, just call it history?
Well, it's not. History is written by the victors, not the victims. And we have a duty. I have a duty. You have a duty. Your handsome boyfriend has a duty.
Husband.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Thank you for that warning shot across my bows. We have a duty to tell the truth. Voltaire said the one duty we owe to history is to tell the truth. And I think that's very, very appropriate, fair, and honest. We have to tell the truth. The history of not so much lesbians and not so much of transgendered people, but the history of gay men has been the story of 1,000-year persecution, of executions, torture, imprisonment, hangings, hung, drawn, and quarterings. All those terrible things have gone on and still go on. It is only 5 or 6 or 7 years ago since ISIS raged through Syria and Iraq and were throwing gay men off the tops of apartment blocks. So it's not an academic question. It's not a kind of nice debate that we can have. It's a life and death thing. We have to have our history. Other people have their history. We've been denied our history. It's been sanitized, it's been cleansed, it's been destroyed, it's been wiped from the record. So we have to try and reconstruct it. And the only bits of history that we have are generally to be found in judicial history and judicial documents,
it's
because
a history of
our
criminology.
history is a history of crime and punishment, mostly punishment.
Do you think then, thinking about Oscar Wilde, he was Irish and he was gay. Do you think his position as an outsider in both of those camps impacted on the way he saw British society and therefore his observations and his writings?
To be absolutely honest, I think the Irish aspect of Wilde has been over-egged.
Right.
I feel that it's very often cited that he was an outsider. He was not an outsider. His father was a surgeon by royal appointment, Sir William Wilde. Oscar grew up, he went to a boarding school in Northern Ireland, and his mother was a fashionable Irish nationalist. It's not as if he was a real outsider. He was Irish. I think his Irishness gave him a different cultural perspective. I mean, Sir William Wilde collected Irish fairy stories and things like that. So I think there's a lot of cultural stuff. But I don't buy this idea as Oscar Wilde as an outsider. I mean, he left Ireland when he was 20 and went back once.
Right.
You know, it's not, I don't agree with it. I'm sorry. Other people will want to wax lyrical about it, but I don't agree with it.
And how then about his homosexuality? How do you think that informed his observations and maybe satire of the British class system?
Well, I think Oscar, like a lot of gay men then and now and throughout history, had a difficult time coming to terms with his sexuality. I think his marriage was one of convenience.
Mm-hmm.
I think he married for, a safe amount of money coming in every year, rain or shine.
Yeah, Constance had an income, didn't she?
He had an income. And I think also there was the kind of bacteriological, biological, moral safety and sanctity within the marriage. It protected him from the rigors. Remember, when Oscar Wilde was a boy, homosexuality was punishable by death.
What were the attitudes when he was gadding about in hotels in Mayfair? And we'll talk a little bit around that in a moment. But when he was gadding around London with Lord Alfred Douglas or Robbie Robbins or the young boys he picked up in Mayfair, what was the attitude towards homosexuality at the time? How much of a risk was he taking?
Well, he was taking an enormous risk. He was defying convention. I mean, it's very hard to try and recreate the kind of almost total homophobia that prevailed in the 19th century. And I know that some recent writers have somehow tried to say, oh, well, it wasn't as bad as all that. It was. So I think he deliberately confronted society. He threw down the gauntlet and said, you know, challenge me if you dare. He was aided and abetted in this, and in fact, the instigator was Bosie. Bosie was far more of a radical than Oscar. Oscar was much more cautious.
Tell us a little bit about Bosie then. So Lord Alfred Douglas, aristocrat. It wasn't called gay or homosexual. They wouldn't have understood those terms. They would have called it Uranian love. Is that right? Can you tell us a little bit about Uranian love, and then we'll chat about Bosie? What was Uranian love?
I think Uranian love was a bit like in the 60s when the word gay came in. Gay is universal now, but in the 1960s, people were called homosexuals. And in fact, the BBC used to call gay people homosexuals until about 5 years ago. And then they made a decision to call them gay. So in the 1880s, 1890s, the concept of Uranian love started to come into effect amongst the cognoscenti. It wasn't widely known. People in the street didn't say, oh, there's a couple of Uranians. Uranians self-identified themselves. So I think people were so before. They were just, they kind of knew who they were. And that was it. They didn't necessarily have a name for it.
Do you think it's more dangerous? Do you think it's more dangerous to claim an identity? Are you more dangerous as a group?
Yes, you are.
To identify. Tell us why.
Because the moment you identify as a group, you become a threat to society.
Right.
And you have to look at the context. In the 19th century, Britain was an empire. It ruled a third of the world. Militarily and economically. It required a kind of military class, a kind of masculinity, a kind of Spartan quality, which sex between men seemed to attack and undermine like a sort of terrible creeping virus. So I think it was an affront. Sex between men was an affront. And you have to remember, too, that it was, a sin in the Bible. And it wasn't just a kind of minor sin. it was a huge, major sin. And that biblical condemnation of sex between men had defined British law for 1,000 years, more or less.
But interestingly, you talk about the military side of the empire, very masculine, very Spartan way of living. But actually, if you dig a little bit deeper, sex between members of the army and rent boys and Uranians was actually quite prevalent. It was there. I've even heard you talk about it existing in India, out there in the empire. So the army
it did exist. I'm not saying it didn't exist. It did exist. But it existed at the price of a criminal conviction and possibly lifetime imprisonment or possibly execution.
And Bosie was a central part of his journey. Could you tell us a little bit about their relationship?
Well, Bosie was introduced to Oscar and didn't really like him very much. He thought he was quite a nice person, but
he didn't fancy
Oscar, sorry?
He didn't fancy him.
He didn't fancy him. And Oscar fancied Bosie. Anyway, they met, they chatted, they got on. Nothing really happened until Bosie was suddenly caught up in a blackmailing scandal at Oxford. And he was being blackmailed over a letter that he'd written to a boy. We don't know the circumstances, but he wrote to Oscar to appeal for help because he didn't know what else to do. So Oscar hired George Lewis, his solicitor, who was a famous society solicitor, to hush it up. So George Lewis met the blackmailer, paid the blackmailer off, and it all went away. And Bosie was grateful, humbled, and then, the alchemy of love happened and they fell in love.
And did they fall in love? I mean, do you believe it was love? Because it was a pretty toxic relationship, wasn't it? It was very, very dramatic.
Well, I mean, you're perhaps a little younger than I, but I've come across about 20 million drama queens in my life. I think most gay people love a drama. I think most relationships are dramatic. I think it was toxic at times, but I think it was also wonderful. There were lots of flouncing outs, lots of screaming matches, lots of sex, not necessarily with each other, but with other people.
It wasn't monogamous, was it? It wasn't a monogamous relationship at all.
Far from monogamous.
No.
And it was also a politicized relationship. Bosie was much more radical than Oscar. He was much more determined to confront homophobia and to try and seek change. And he swept Oscar up and caught him up, and they went along with it.
And it was Bosie's father, I believe, Lord Queensbury, who it was through him that the original court case took place. So Queensbury believed his son was infected by Oscar and wanted to get Oscar. Is that right?
Oscar and Bosie had been cavorting around London as a gay couple in the 19th century when such things were barely heard of, and it was a public scandal. Queensbury thought that his son had been corrupted by Oscar. He asked his son not to see Oscar. Bosie refused and sent a note to a postcard to Lord Queensbury saying, "What a funny little man you are," enraging Queensbury. Oscar and Bosie went off to Algeria. While they were in Algeria, the Marquis of Queensbury left a card at Oscar's club saying to Oscar Wilde, now some versions say posing as a sodomite, some versions say Ponce and sodomite.
And what do you think it says, and why is it important? Because I think
Well, I've seen the card and I think it says Ponce and sodomite.
And why would that be important, and why would Queensbury change his mind in court?
Well, I don't think I'm not really sure if Queensbury ever really owned up to what he wrote, but I think it said Ponce and sodomite. Basically, he was throwing down a gauntlet.
And Ponce would mean that Oscar was living off the immoral earnings of prostitutes, which, if it went to court, Queensbury couldn't have proved because it wasn't true. Do you think that maybe he changed his tale because he had some counsel saying, you'll lose any court case if you put that forward, because Oscar, you can't accuse Oscar of this because it's not true?
Well, I think that's a good point. And I don't really have a clear view on that. So we'll leave that up in the ether for further debate and discussion.
Okay.
But so Oscar was in a sort of fairly depressed and parlous state financially. The marriage with Constance had more or less finished. They were living apart. He was persuaded by Bosie and by Robbie Ross that they should sue the Marquis of Queensbury for criminal libel.
Because the Marquis had left this accusation at Oscar's club, so basically a public.
So it had been published. It had technically been published.
Yeah.
Even though only the hall porter had seen it.
Yeah. And he sued Queensbury for libel, didn't he?
Criminal libel.
Criminal libel. Why do you think he would have? I mean, he would have sued Queensbury. He was having sex. I know your book calls out the fact that he, did have penetrative sex. So why do you think he sued? It's the big question. Why didn't he creep away to France like so many other people might have done?
Well, I think he was egged on by Bosie. And I think he genuinely believed that, by taking Queensbury to court, he could shut him up.
Okay.
He wildly miscalculated. Oscar was not good on detail. He airily dismissed the fact that, he'd slept with dozens and dozens and dozens of male prostitutes, that he'd had sex with hundreds of young men. That there were witnesses, there were letters, and there were male prostitutes only too ready to testify.
So when the case came to court, Oscar loses, Queensbury is victorious.
No, not quite. The case comes to court. The first case ended in a kind of hung verdict.
Yes.
So another trial for criminal libel took place. And in that trial, Oscar was asked by Edward Carson, have you ever kissed Walter Granger, who was a servant in their house in Oxfordshire? And Oscar said, oh dear me, no, he's far too ugly. And that was the point where he admitted, where it all fell apart. And then the trial was abandoned, and Oscar went to the Cadogan Hotel, where he was later arrested and charged with gross indecency. He was lucky.
His usual witticisms, which had done him so well to that point, actually did him in. He retired to the Cadogan Hotel. Why didn't he flee? Why didn't he get on the boat into France?
He could have done. He could have fled before his arrest, and he could have fled after he was, he had time to flee. Frank Harris said, I've got a steam yacht waiting at Margate to take you to France. He could have easily fled.
So why
he didn't? I don't think anyone can possibly know. I think it was something to do with the fact that he was a fatalist. I think he thought that still, even when it got to court, he might win the case. I think fleeing would have been an admission that he was guilty. And I think also he wanted to make a statement about Uranian love. And the night before he was sentenced, he wrote a beautiful letter to Bosie saying, and I'm paraphrasing because I can't remember the exact wording, it is perhaps through the horror of going to prison that I will prove to myself and to the world that Uranian love is noble. And I think he was caught up in that drama. I think like most people, we don't think things will happen to us.
Yeah.
We don't think that.
I mean, he could have been in absolute shock and stupor at what had happened. And maybe if he had a decent night's sleep and woke up and thought differently, but maybe he was in shock. I mean, it would have shocked any of us what had happened. His fall from grace.
I think he was paralyzed.
Yeah,
paralyzed. By shock. Yeah. Paralyzed by fear. And he didn't know quite what to do. I think he'd set out on this path. I also think there was something too that he thought most writers want immortality. Very few achieve it. For every great and immortal writer, there are about 2 million failed, forgotten writers. And I think Oscar perhaps sensed, and this is entirely speculation, I don't know, but perhaps he sensed that becoming a martyr, going to prison, he may actually achieve literary immortality.
Even then, he was thinking about his future reputation. Do you think there was a government cover-up? There's some questions about the Prime Minister at the time, Lord Rosebery, and the Liberal government, whether or not he was a homosexual, and therefore they went hard after Oscar. What are your thoughts on that?
I do think there was a government cover-up. Lord Rosebery was supposedly in a relationship with Bosie's older brother, Lord Drumlanrig. And Lord Drumlanrig had committed suicide while out shooting. And he'd shot himself to stop the scandal of his relationship with Lord Rosebery coming out.
It was hinted at in court, wasn't it? There was definitely some mention of Rosebery, and therefore it might have alarmed the government if this came out. Let Oscar be the fall guy rather than the Prime Minister.
There were all kinds of sort of vibrations in court and kind of veiled references and threats. And certainly during the time of Wilde's trial, Lord Rosebery was confined to bed.
Yes, he was very ill, wasn't he? Probably with stress what was going to come out.
Well, he was basically having a complete mental breakdown while this trial was going on, and only recovered when Oscar was safely in prison and the trial seemed to go away. So there are some pieces of evidence, but there isn't the kind of killer document. Perhaps that will emerge.
So Oscar has 2 years in jail. He then leaves and goes to France, and he's reunited with Bosie.
Yes.
But when Oscar dies, I know Bosie didn't quite make it to his deathbed. But what happened to Bosie? That it's something I really want to find out more about. What happened to Bosie?
He got married. He married a young poetess. The marriage didn't last.
Surprising.
He became a Catholic convert, and he lived his life out in Hove until the beginning of the war, when he was taken in by a local farmer and his wife, who were Catholics, and they sort of sheltered him for 2 or 3 years until he died. That woman's name was Sheila Cook. She only died about 15 or 20 years ago. I did manage to meet her, which was quite extraordinary. It's extraordinary the length that when you look back at history, how long ago it can seem, and then suddenly how close. When
absolutely, he was alive in the 40s and
shells
living
of
just
Bosie.
outside Brighton. That's amazing.
So that is extraordinary.
What?
And he had various legal battles, usually with Robbie Ross. He died during the Second World War, and I think it was quite sad because he was quite an accomplished poet, and he was, we would call him an activist now. He was politicized, he was determined, he was brave. I mean, he offered to come back when Oscar was on trial and say, actually, it was me. So he wasn't a coward.
Yeah.
And it was a love affair. I mean, when Oscar wrote De Profundis, it was the worst and most bitter period in his life. He'd been told that Bosie had abandoned him, which wasn't true. And he wrote this absolutely sort of bitter and twisted narrative, which of course has now influenced modern opinions. But, after he got out of prison, they got back together.
Yeah, they did,
in
didn't they?
Naples, and they only separated because the money from Constance and the money from Bosie's mother, they were threatened that it would be shut off. So they had to strategically separate, but then they both lived together in Paris. Not together, but they both lived in Paris at the same time and saw each other. So, it wasn't this awful, destructive love affair which sent Oscar to prison, and that was it.
Oh, it's nice to hear that they kept together. We're still talking about Oscar Wilde 130 years later. Why do you think he continues to fascinate us?
Well, I think he was an incredibly talented writer and thinker. I think he was one of the very first modern writers. I think he had a different approach to literature. I think he used his epigrams to split intellectual atoms. I think he was a genius. I think he saw things differently. And he was a giant of a man. And, giants stand out by their sheer giantness, if that's the word.
Well, it's been absolutely fascinating talking to you about Oscar Wilde, The Secret Life of Oscar Wilde by Neil McKenna. I can't recommend it more strongly than that. Thank you so much for giving us an insight into Oscar Wilde and your thoughts as a writer on him. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.